Good evening. Is this on? Yeah? Okay, well, you can hear me anyway. Hey, good evening. Thank you for all coming out, and for our live streaming audience, hi there. I'll try to stick to the microphone. Our speaker has one on her lapel, so you'll be able to hear better than last week. Just a quick housekeeping detail. You know, unless we have a hurricane, there's going to be a walking tour of Trinity College on Saturday, and it starts there. The flyers out in the hall tell you what it is and when it is. It's at 10 a.m., and it leaves from the Trinity Chapel parking lot. Trinity College campus is amazing, and if you've never had the Cook's tour from somebody who knows a lot about it, Alden Gordon is a longtime art professor there, architecture, and so he'll be leading that on Saturday. This evening, we have the pleasure of Fiona Vernal, who has done so much for a good long time here with Hartford history, and she earned a BA in history with a certificate in African American studies from Princeton, and an MA and PhD from Yale. She was formerly the director of African American Studies at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. Since 2005, she has taught at the UConn Department of History, where her courses focus on pre-colonial and colonial Africa, the history of South Africa, slavery, and the African diaspora. She is a great believer in the importance of the public life of history, mounting exhibitions like Children of the Soil, Generations of South Africans Under Apartheid, Child Labor and Human Rights in Africa, and an exhibition currently on view at the Hartford Public Library's Hartford History Center, From Civil Rights to Human Rights, African American, Puerto Rican, and West Indian Housing Struggles in Hartford County, Connecticut. As a member of the planning team for the Hartford History Series, our series here, she has underscored the importance of going beyond the familiar to explore the Hartford histories of across the spectrum of cultural heritage. Welcome, Fiona Vernal, to speak about why Hartford's ethnic heritage matters today. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So Bill doctored my bio, so I don't have an exhibit currently at the Hartford History Center because the Hartford History Center is not open to the public because of the previous flood, but is in service at the Ropkins branch. I also blame Bill for dragging me into yet another new topic. But I feel like I'm in really good company. I will also stay right next to the podium so that I don't wander away from the mic. All right, so in about 3 to 4 years, maybe 5, if you're walking in the Frog Hollow neighborhood near Zion Hill Cemetery, there might be a memorial garden with a plaque. Parroting the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the plaque might say, quote, "On this site stood Deborah Chapel, an intact Jewish funerary mortuary that showcases the story of Jewish women's leadership within 19th century religious and communal organizations." That's my nightmare. There we go. The loss of this building, I'm still parroting the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The loss of this building represents a missed opportunity to honor that history while reactivating the space for a new use, end quote. When you walk by the Deborah Chapel, now demolished as of August 2023, I think maybe August 23rd, 2023, it was hard for the casual passerby to understand the value, purpose, and history of the structure simply based on the aesthetics of the place. Beyond its relationship to the cemetery, the building had turned out to be an eyesore in the neighborhood for a long time. How would the public know that this building engaged an important part of the relic of Hartford's ethnic past? While I'm sure the garden will be beautiful, it is a poor substitute for commemorating Jewish women's roles in public life, in funerary practices, and in charitable and philanthropic and community engagement, even as those roles are very well documented in the Jewish Historical Society archives, for example. I start here because Deborah Chapel, the entire Front Street neighborhood, Hartford's Black Bottom, the Talcott Street Congregational Church, so many other of Hartford's monuments are all ghosts of Hartford's past that gives us a glimpse of what its ethnic heritage was. For the Deborah Chapel, a glimpse of the ethnic heritage. For the former church on Talcott Street, a glimpse of its Black past. Another glimpse of Hartford's heritage comes from the press. The Hartford Courant published a series of articles in 1915 highlighting the city's ethnic heritage. The articles ran between August of 1915 and November of 1915 in the special featured edition, which was the Sunday edition. And then they did one more article in 1916. The article feature masthead looked like this, and it usually says, the Scottish people who lived in Hartford, the Italian people who lived in Hartford, the Swedish people who lived in Hartford, and so on and so forth. And so I'll go through and give you a sense of what you would have been reading in your Sunday edition in 1915. So here is the Scottish piece, which has no subtitle, but which noted that the people of Scottish ancestry have played an important part specifically in the social, business, religious, and ethnic life of the city. Most of the articles followed the usual pattern. They tried to identify who was the historic first in the Greater Hartford region, and then it provided a catalog of names of notable individuals who've made a contribution to Hartford's heritage, and then it moved on to do a little bit of demographic and contemporary history, putting the names of folks who worked as letter carriers, folks who worked for the Health Commission, and then it concluded by reminding the reader and the audience that the Scottish people, or the Jewish people, or the Italian people had made really important contributions to the city's heritage. Here is the Swedish people who live in Hartford, which was the second in the series. Here is the Italian people who lived in Hartford, which was the third in the series. This is the only one with barefoot children who are included as part of the story. And here is the colored people who live in Hartford. Now, I've used this particular article many times over in my classes. It is an absolutely fantastic piece of portraiture. This is one of the few places where you can get a sample of what some prominent members of the African American community looked like. But I've always read this particular article outside of the context of the series in which it was published. This series was billed as a profile of the ethnic contributions of Hartford's communities, and every other ethnic group featured was a white ethnic group who was profiled as a particular kind of immigrant group. And so the Italian people who lived in Hartford noted that Italians had special abilities in industry that also made them a valuable part of the city's life, that there were approximately 12,000 people in the city of Italian birth or ancestry at the time in 1915, and that of the $110 million on the grand list, that they were responsible for 10 million of it, and were growing in importance in terms of their overall numbers as well as property ownership. To give you the sense of the kind of language that this feature was interested in highlighting, the article also stated, "The rise of the Italian is one of the most interesting illustrations of the assimilation of American ideas by a foreigner. He started in Hartford as elsewhere, as a digger of ditches, as a peddler of rags, and as the banana man. Now he's a banker, a businessman, and a professional man with a degree. He is proud of his rise and makes no attempt to disguise it. In fact, he does not disguise the fact that he once worked with his hands. He no longer digs ditches. He hires other men to dig ditches for him. The Italian day labor, the day of the Italian day labor in Hartford was passing because they were now a small minority." This census and this demographic profile and the contribution to property is very distinct to the Italian population and to the Jewish profile. So the Jewish people who lived in Hartford specifically noted that there are about 150 Jewish families in the city, and that at the time of the article in November of 1915, there were over 16,000 people of Jewish descent living in Hartford, and that they constituted about 10% of the population. They acknowledged that, like the Italians, they too had made an important contribution to the city of Hartford. They had become useful citizens and had become a force for good in the body politic, and were particularly good at being upholders of the American ideal. And so, blaming Bill, I wondered what on earth is going on here with all of these different groups in Hartford, and why did they include African Americans in an article series that was meant to profile what was going on with assimilation among white ethnics in Hartford. Assimilation was key here. In these articles, the United States was cast as a nation of immigrants. I know we've all heard that before, and I was curious to see how far back we were using that term in the article, and what it is that this particular series meant to convey about being a nation of immigrants. A tremendous effort was placed on the fraternal, social, professional, and religious organizations that all of these groups created, as well as all of the affinity groups and networks that they created once they had settled in the city. They all extolled these groups, both for having individual ethnic heritage organizations, but also assimilating to American life. Some of the articles are filled with comedy, so of course there's a discussion of odd dishes, odd foodways, codfish and milk. For example, holiday celebrations of the Swedish were singled out as particularly distinct. There was, in these articles between 1915 and 1916, a guarded respect for religious traditions, or at least a guarded respect for the principle of religious plurality. And the growth in various denominations, whether it's the Baptist denominations, the Jewish denominations, the various iterations of Methodist denominations among different groups, the Presbyterian denominations, these all featured prominently and were giving a lot of space in the articles. It was only when I realized that this particular article on the colored people who lived in Hartford was in fact a part of this series that I began to see how much it stuck out compared to every other group. In continuing the search, there was one small piece of comedy as well on the Hungarians, but they were so early in their assimilation in Hartford that they did not yet deserve a full feature. Instead, they got a very short paragraph that literacy, English literacy lessons were just beginning, and that the organization of fraternal groups was only underway. So I'm going to have to check to see when the Hungarians advance enough to get their own feature. I have mined the African American article to highlight really important contributions of the men, and it is all men who are profiled there. Now it's really stuck. Mariana, it's stuck. You think you can help me get it unstuck? Wait, no. So as I went through, thank you. As I went through, yes. So as you can see, only men are profiled here. And I think that some of us know the usual stories about, especially about Alfred Plato, for example. But I was very curious about this gentleman in the far right, you're right, that looks like he's wearing a turban. And I wondered what his story was. And it turns out that he had moved to Hartford in the 19th century, late 19th century, and then was eventually sent off to Sierra Leone as our very first consul. And this is the image that he submitted of himself, so I'm not sure what kind of conversion experience he underwent. Eventually, he was recalled, and you should not be too surprised to find out that he had a barbershop just down the street from us, because barbering was one of the few methods that African American men had to be able to create a little bit of autonomy for himself. We would never know that he had a barbershop. There are very few monuments to men like these. Missing from this is someone like Catherine Freebody, who, by process of elimination and going through this particular article and making a list of all of the names, I realized that there were so many other stories, but this article provided a really important sort of method for me to link all of these people, put them on a map, figure out where they were all living, and coming to the conclusion that so many of them were helping each other out to identify places to live, were using their existing social networks to help each other with mortgages. But the most important personality who emerged more from her absence than anything here is a young woman by the name of Catherine Freebody, who I discovered at the Connecticut State Library. Catherine Freebody's family, very little is known about them. Her mother, we know nothing about. Her father, however, London Freebody, participated in the Revolutionary War. At the time that I discovered Catherine, she had more money in her bank account than I did. And this is somebody from the 1830s. And so I was really curious about where she got all of her money from in the 1830s. Catherine left a will that left a bequest to various charitable and benevolent organizations in Hartford, including the American Missionary Society. But she was very explicit that she was committed to the education of colored children, and so she set aside money for them. You are not looking at Catherine because there is no picture of her. But the bulk of her estate she left to pay the salary of James Pennington. In language that demonstrated that she was aware of what was going on in Hartford's Black community, she indicated that she wanted the bulk of her estate to go to the Talcott Street Congregational Church to defray the expenses of their minister, no matter what name they chose for themselves in the future, right? Whether they call themselves the African Church, whether they call themselves the Talcott Church, whether they call themselves the Fifth Congregational Church. And this shows just how plugged in she was to what was going on with all of the discussions that were happening. In looking at Catherine, I wondered why no one had unearthed her. Her will was right there. Part of it was published in the Hartford Courant, so Bill is absolutely right that that is a great place to start your sleuthing if you're interested in African American history in Hartford. And from doing a little bit of digging in trying to answer why this Black woman in 1832 had far more money than I did in 2023, I found that I thought her father, London Freebody, might have gotten a pension from his Revolutionary War service. It turns out that London returned to Granby, got sold the worst farmland in Granby, and ended up in debtor's prison in Hartford. And so that turned out to be a dead end. And then I continued to look at the will, and I noticed one line from the will where her executor added wages to the inventory of the will. And that executor of the will turned out to be none other than the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Connecticut. I dug a little bit further in the will and found that she left the residual of property that she had purchased and asked that the residual go to the Talcott Church. I hunted for 3 months for that woman, trying to find this property, and it turns out the nephew of the Chief Justice was in fact the one who had purchased the land and had kept the land in his name, but noted in the property registry that he purchased it for her, but it was not conveyed in her lifetime. And so I go through some of those details to give you a sense of, it took me an entire year to find all of these little snippets of Catherine Freebody. And I added up all of the money, and I still was missing a lot of her money. And so I dug a little bit deeper, and I thought, well, London may have made a few bad decisions in Granby, but his daughter ended up in the family of the Griswolds, being educated by them. I'm not sure what educated means. That's the specific language. And I thought, well, maybe in Granby, I'd find some clues. And so I spent about 8 hours in the deeds office and found Catherine engaged in numerous land transactions with all kind of white people, white men, men, in Granby. And that was the source of a lot of her wealth that she was then able to leave to the Talcott Street Church. And so it made me wonder what is there in the absence. As grateful as I am to have the stories of all of these men, I am hot on the trails of Mr. Consul General Bolin Bowser. I have his address of where his barbershop was. But this article in documenting these men makes me realize that there are so many other untold stories, and that there is so much work that remains to be done in trying to not only unearth these stories, but to place these stories in relation to each other and ask, what is it that African Americans are doing in a series about immigration and assimilation in the United States? And why is it that the colored people who lived in Hartford were inserted here? Whereas the Jewish community was especially signal for upholding American ideals, as well as the Italian community, although there was one note that there might be some Bolshevik sympathies among the Jews. Black people in this particular article were described as a peaceful and orderly contingent. And of all the groups, the Jewish, the Swedish, the Italian, the Scottish, the Irish, they were the only ones whose conduct was described with a language of surveillance and a language of a rewarding quietism, as long as African Americans are not militant, as long as they are quiescent, as long as they continue in this tradition of creating their own churches, of not asking to be part of the broader fabric, they would be welcomed and be given a feature in the Hartford Courant. The article does go on to note, as you can see here, that they have their own churches, their own fraternities, and other social organizations, but ends with, but are a peaceful and orderly contingent, a credit to the city in which they live. This article appeared just a few weeks after Black ministers asked that the Birth of Nation not be screened in Hartford, a plea which fell on deaf ears and had a wonderful run. The Birth of a Nation had a wonderful run in Hartford and in the rest of Connecticut, and had such a wonderful run that it came back the very next year. So by the time they're running the Irish people who lived in Hartford, you have the Birth of a Nation dominating some of the news feed. So this is going to be the fourth time that I use this article in my classes, and I now get to place this article in a broader conversation. I've never really taken a 20th century article about African Americans and placed it in a broader conversation about immigration and assimilation. I worked my way through these articles seeking evidence about how the Courant portrayed white ethnics up to World War I, and especially in the aftermath of a restrictive immigration policy that characterized the end to open immigration from Europe. Or at least that is the narrative we are told, right? That sometime in the 1920s, between literacy tests, with the coming of the quota system, with the coming of passports in 1924, that immigration became much more restrictive, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. But in fact, even with the quota system, it actually turned out that only 1% of the 25 million immigrants who came between the 1880s and on the eve of World War I, only 1% were actually excluded by all of these measures to curb immigration. And what emerged from the research instead is an image of how Hartford became home to a succession of immigrant communities who searched for employment, asylum, family reunification, and their own vision of a better life was lauded as the typical immigrant arc and the typical immigrant story. As a result, the city's population doubled between 1900 and 1930, so Hartford goes from about 79,000 people, almost 80,000 people, to over 164,000 people. In going through the coverage of this population trend, you do have a lot of articles that focus on what we would call negative coverage. So there's a lot of articles that focus on barefoot children. There are a lot of articles that focus on white ethnic poverty, on high rents and challenges that are faced, on the fact that this succession of Italian, Polish, Russian, and Irish migrants had access to Hartford's worst housing stock, for example. But the articles noted in the Hartford Courant that this was just a temporary condition, that white ethnic groups tended to follow this trajectory, and by the time you get the first and the second generation, they could no longer be described using the same terms, right? So the first generation, even though they might have lived in slum conditions. Many of them were poor. Maybe the Italians were ditch diggers, right? They rose above. They were able to accomplish the American ideal. In the same time period that you see this narrative of these groups emerge in, I checked to see what the accompanying narrative was for African Americans. I wasn't too hopeful, given the Birth of a Nation thing fell on deaf ears. And what I found was that the doubling and the tripling of the African American population in this same time period that you have these articles circulating generated really specious narratives about racial contagion, about racial invasion from the South, about the fact that if African Americans did not engender slum conditions in their living conditions, then sometimes maybe they brought the slum with them. So if an African American community shows up, you could bet that that was soon going to be a slum community. And so instead of focusing on high rents and the fact that from the 19th century, some of the things, the alarming statistics that we hear about the disproportionate rent burden that people face, the fact that sometimes 30 to 40%, people are paying 30 to 40% of their income on rent now, and are facing really high eviction rates, and are living in really vulnerable areas vulnerable to flooding, to climate change, to the sewage backing up in their homes in Hartford. Instead of that narrative, what we have is that African Americans have actually been facing disproportionate rents, have been paying 30 to 40% of their income for a very long time. This is not an artifact of the 21st century. And as I continued to compare the coverage of these articles, you have these ascendant celebratory immigrant narratives associated with all of these groups, the Jewish, the Swedish, etc. Whatever travails they face, whatever challenges the first generation faced, they were able to use that assimilationist escape hatch and move into the middle class. By the time we're transitioning to the post-war period, just sampling what the coverage looked like, you could see how being beneficiaries of the GI Bill, having access to loans that can help you to buy a home outside of Hartford, in Hartford, right, completely places the trajectory of these white ethnic groups compared to the African Americans who, the first generation having overcome these challenges, are able to take their place among the middle class, assimilated immigrant communities, or at least that is the narrative that this newspaper is participating in, and who are then portrayed in 1940s and 1950s language as grateful, patriotic citizens, maybe not the Germans, lots of negative coverage about people of German ancestry, who were now able to participate in the American dream of owning a home and doing much better than their parents did. As the narrative shifts into the 1960s and 1970s, the vast majority of these communities leave Hartford. And I think most of you in this audience understand where folks went. The patterns of community succession in Hartford brings Puerto Ricans and brings West Indians. It brings more African Americans from the South. And the narrative of African Americans don't change. There is still this sense that somehow, if Black people move into a neighborhood, it's going to become a slum neighborhood. If it doesn't actually have slum conditions, your property values are going to be impacted. And so you have this ascendant story of immigrant communities leaving Hartford, going to West Hartford, going to Wethersfield, going to Bloomfield. Something very similar is unfolding in Fairfield County. Something similar is unfolding in New Haven County. And that ascendance is what stands out in this narrative. Unfortunately, what stands out for Hartford is that the enduring coverage of African Americans and the new populations who join them, the Puerto Ricans and the West Indians, comes exactly at the time when Hartford is on the front lines of post-industrial decline, the flight of capital from the city, so people are leaving the city in droves and they're taking the money with them. Corporate headquarters are leaving the city in droves and taking the money and the jobs with them. And Puerto Ricans and African Americans are immobilized in the city for a little while, just for a little while. Soon, a subsection of African Americans and a subsection of West Indians will be able to pursue that same immigrant dream. But they don't necessarily do so with the GI Bill. They don't necessarily take the same path. Instead, there are a lot of people trafficking in a stereotype of a model minority, you know, whether we want to call it the talented 10th for African Americans, whether we want to cite West Indians as a very particular kind of aspirant Black who has dreams of owning a home and whose dreams will take him out of Hartford. And so as the Jewish community is leaving Hartford, African Americans succeed them in the North End. There's a lot of evidence from oral histories that a lot of members of the Jewish community are serving as, if not straw buyers, or fronting the mortgages of African Americans when they're denied credit, of West Indians when they are denied credit. And in this way, West Indian home ownership skyrockets and is still among the highest in the city. And so, thank you, Bill, for the challenge of taking the deep interest that I've developed in telling the story of how Hartford became an African American, a West Indian, and a Caribbean community. That was my starting point for my research. And asking what this narrative has to do with the story of white ethnic migration and settlement in Hartford, and then the stories that we tell about white ethnic migration and settlement in Hartford. And in terms of drawing all of this together, I just want to take us to a particular landscape. And I think, Mariana, whenever I take too long to do this, it decides to slow down. On what was an ad hoc, fascinating walking tour of Hartford that we planned with teachers, someone said, a walking tour of Hartford? That you think tourists are actually gonna want to go on, even if it's free? Like a walking tour of the north end of Hartford, I'm sorry. Are people going to feel safe? Are people going to want to go? What is there to see in the north end of Hartford? And so I will end here with what is there to see? And this is just the sliver. So I picked Old North Cemetery because I was wondering, when I was looking at the Deborah Chapel, I was trying to find when was the last date when a Jewish person was buried in Old North, and whether we could take all of the gravestones and the burial dates and kind of pinpoint migration out of Hartford. And I wandered around in Old North Cemetery so much that I ended up with this deep fascination for cemeteries that I never had before as somebody who grew up in Jamaica and kind of believed in ghosts, and I was always afraid of being in a cemetery by myself. And so here is Old North Cemetery. And to the north is Union Baptist Church. And you can tell fascinating stories there about African American heritage, about migrants coming in from the South and creating their own denominations, and then using those denominations to engage in the same kind of work that the women at the Deborah Chapel were engaged in. They were engaged in deep philanthropic work, right, that exceeded the bounds of being a congregant in this church. To the very south, at the very edge of the map, is the Women's League, which provides daycare for so many people in the North End. Well, that was the initiative of many of the, in terms of vision, of the wives of many of the ministers in Hartford who wanted to do something to help the African American women who were coming in the Great Migration, who may have had children, didn't have proper childcare, and didn't have access to housing. And so the Women's League served as that network for them to help them settle down in the city. And it's still there today. It's been renovated many times, but they have their archives, they have their records, they have the photographs. It's a fascinating, story. Close to Main Street, not visible on this map, end of the bus stop, where if you wanted to go and work in Shade Tobacco, that's one of the places you could hop on the bus. There's no plaque there. You have no idea. It just looks like the detritus of some past in Hartford, and you can't figure out what this old bus stop is for. Of course, I left a couple of things on this map. I don't think anybody is going to have a memorial garden should Save a Lot disappear from the map, or the T-Mobile store, right? But just a little bit to the south, we have Sand Elementary School, right? Captures the vision that African Americans had and have always had about getting a proper and decent, fair education in their own neighborhoods, right? In their own neighborhoods, not having to get on a bus and go to Simsbury or West Hartford to get a good education, but try to get a good education in your own neighborhood. There's Bellevue Square. There's the Hartford Housing Authority, right? And so as we were on this walking tour, and then we ended up on Albany Avenue, and we could spend 7 hours on Albany Avenue talking about the Hattie Holmes settlement, Black women's participation in civic and philanthropic work. We could talk about the old and new businesses. There's a beauty parlor there, and one of the stories there is, where were Black women going to get their hair done? Like, this is, if y'all don't know anything about Black women, where do you get your hair done? In 1960, in 1970, right? Even someone like Edna Negron, who has the most beautiful mane of Black hair that I've seen in a long time, when she was young, as a Puerto Rican, she went into local places to get her hair cut, and they wouldn't cut her hair. They would not service her. They asked her to go in the back where the Black beauticians were and offered her a perm, right? And so there are all of these ways in which the built environment said no to Puerto Ricans and African Americans, West Indians, but now we can look at the remnants of that built environment. We can walk up and down Albany Avenue. We can walk up and down Main Street and say, this is where Reverend Battles met Dr. King, right? We can say, this is where people took their stand. This is where Malcolm X visited and held meetings. There are so many stories that can be told. And going through this exercise of trying to place African American history in conversation with the history of white ethnic migration to Hartford, and not the history as it's recounted in the Hartford Current. has brought me on this circular path to make me ask questions about not only who's missing from the record, right? So all of those individuals who dot the cover of these articles, to ask who's missing, so somebody like Catherine Freebody, who's completely missing, but to ask what kind of stories can we tell with the existing ghosts, as well as the communities that are still here, still present, very much alive. So as we wring our hands about whether there should be a memorial garden, Hollow, after we've already taken down this really important monument to Hartford's ethnic past, there are far more important ways that we can commemorate Hartford's ethnic heritage. In a petulant act of defiance, I made a massive monument for Old North Cemetery. I was told it had too many words. It's going to be really hard to read. People don't want to read anymore. And I wrote as much as I possibly could get away with and print. And so I invite all of you to take a walk on Hartford's Black Heritage Trail, which was unveiled last year. You will see some monuments in discrete segments along Main Street. And when you get to Old North Cemetery, you can just pull over and the monument is right there. These are so many of the injustices that the colored people of Hartford from that particular article to now have suffered. Right now, I think Doc Hurley is the only Black person who has a monument in the city of Hartford to him. Augustus Washington ran a successful business here. Hartford Hospital is running an office, a medical office out of that building. There's no plaque, no one knows. And so I invite you on this journey, take a walking tour of the North End, ask yourself, not what T-Mobile and Save-A-Lot can tell us, but the remnants, the other remnants of the landscape. And when you think that there aren't a lot of voices, just know that like Catherine Freebody, who is completely absent in our history, that woman wrote herself into history. She wrote a will, she wrote her exact demands. She had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as her executor. He signed her will, his wife signed her will. His nephew bought property for her and made sure her name was on the land record. She's not absent, she's there. And so I invite you on this journey, and maybe next year I will have some update to share with you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. That was fantastic. I'm Jeff Partridge from Connecticut State Community College Capitol, just down the street, one of the organizers of this lecture series. And I now have the microphone to pass around for anybody who has a question for Fiona. And please wait until the microphone gets to you, because we do have people online who will not be able to hear unless we have this. So who's first?
Oh, Professor, what was the address of Augustus Washington's office?
I don't remember.
I couldn't hear that part.
Oh, I don't remember the street. It's right next to the Hartford Hospital.
Okay, on
What's the street?
Jefferson. Okay,
Jefferson? Yeah.
it's on Jefferson. Whereabouts on Jefferson? Oh, because he also had an office in the Delameter building on Main Street, right next to the Company One Firehouse. Mr. DeLamere let him rent one room
And we need a
for his
plaque.
photography studio.
And we need a plaque.
Oh, thank you.
We need a plaque for that. There's a, oh,
Hello, Dr. Fiona Vernal. My name is Rain Michelle Eiffel. I'm the curator at the Connecticut Valley Tobacco Museum, and I just came in contact with the name of William Pickens, Pickens. I was wondering if that name rung a bell to you at all. I understand that he was an HBCU student, specifically from Morehouse, who came to work Shade Tobacco and then found a love, I guess, through his work. I was just wondering if you had any information about his story, if not his story in particular, about any stories from the HBCU students that came to work Shade Tobacco, as far as making homes in Connecticut and Hartford.
so we're at, when I say we, I mean my students and I, are at the very beginning of trying to unearth some of those stories. We know that the forerunner to the National Urban League was responsible for holding meetings with the HBCUs and representatives from Connecticut who was facing severe shortages, especially during 1914, 1918, with so many people going off to war, and recruiting young men from HBCUs. The interesting thing about the HBCUs, though, is that the young men who were recruited were treated completely differently than the ordinary workers, because they're coming here with their professors, with their teachers, right? They're meant to be under really strict discipline. And it was always understood that this is temporary labor for them. They are, after all, right, in college, and they're going to graduate. I'm just seeing if I can pull up the map of the HBCUs. So they were always meant to leave the tobacco fields, and so there's a way in which you can be really triumphant about having Dr. King come to work, about having so many people from all of these universities, so Howard, Virginia State, Hampton, Livingston College, Allen Payne, Morris Brown, Atlanta University, Talladega, Tuskegee, etc. There's a way that you can be really celebratory and triumphant about that heritage, but all of these young men had an alternative path. It's a very different path than the African Americans who are working in tobacco, or the Puerto Ricans or the West Indians who are recruited to work in tobacco and join them. So you have this earn money for tuition, room and board, books, earn a lot of money in Connecticut, go home, go back to Atlanta, go back to Florida, et cetera, versus this cycle of seasonality and vulnerability that, let's say, the West Indian workers have to face, as well as the Puerto Rican workers. But I haven't come across that name specifically, but I can dig into it.
The website that Fiona is showing right now is her website called Hartford Bound, which I use with my students. It's a fantastic resource. Can you tell us how people can find it?
So we have a website called Hartford Bound. We're sort of a play on the folks who were bound for Hartford. When we were asked about whether we were going to work on people who were enslaved in Hartford, we thought, well, that works too. And so it's hartfordbound.com. All of the maps are finished, and we're going to be adding stories to each of the maps. So for example, we're going to add Catherine Freebody's story now that we have her land records, now that we have her will, now that we have all of the court cases. She was constantly suing people for not paying their leases for when they rented from her. We're going to add some stories to this site.
This slide isn't your presentation, but it's fascinating. Are you saying that like Martin Luther King and was part of a recruitment of college students, black college students, and would they come for like just the summer, or was it?
Yep. And they're
And-
supposed to, earn, the advertising is come, earn a little bit of money, pay your tuition, pay for books, pay for room and board.
How was that initiated? How did that start? Do we know?
The forerunner of the Urban League.
Oh, that organized this effort.
Organize sort of setting, making sure that there was transportation, making sure that there was housing, making sure that on the farmers' end, they were able to meet the conditions to accommodate.
It's like a foreign exchange program. It sounds different.
With young black boys from the South.
Hi.
Hi.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing this work you have done in the analysis. I'm connected with Coltsville, and there's going to be some stories told over there when we finally see that national park. And I hope that we won't miss big stories. And at this point, I know nothing about the role that African Americans might have played in that industry. And the national park will look at the mid-1800s up to World War II. So it's a long run. It's not just during Sam Colt's day. And I encourage you, as you're mining the resources that are out there, if you come across that sort of those information about that. I mean, people can look at city directories and all kinds of other primary sources, but it's just going to be a whole lot of work for some people. So, and I think you may be in a position, maybe not to do all that work, but to point at it.
I know I am not trying to become the expert of the Jewish community, the Scottish community, the Italian community.
Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Vernal. Pleasant
Good
to see you.
evening.
I wanted to comment about the African American students that migrated up here to work in the tobacco fields, and specifically Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And most of the time when we hear about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., especially during Black History Month, you know, you'll hear about Simsbury specifically, you know, doing different celebratory presentations about Dr. King coming there and working in the tobacco fields. But if you read, anybody who has, you know, has not seen it, but if you read Dr. King's letters about tobacco, I mean, it was a great opportunity. Like you said, they came with an alternative motive. They came with a specific goal to, you know, work in tobacco and make money. But he speaks specifically about it was hard, it was grueling, but it was our journey into Hartford, Connecticut, into the North End, which really changed the trajectory of his life. You know, this was one of the first times when he came up north and where he didn't have to sit on the back of the bus. He came into downtown Hartford and he could sit at the lunch counter at Woolworth's. You know, coming up here at 15 years old, and this is something that I'm disgruntled about because this is history in Hartford that is so significant, not just to Hartford, but to national history and world history. When Dr. King went to Oslo, Norway, you talked about him and Dr. Richard Battles. It was Dr. Richard Battles that went over to Oslo, Norway with him to, you know, honor him to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And we don't have, like I said, those monuments, those plaques. Nothing is really out there in the North End of Hartford. I didn't even know about the bus stop where they picked up the tobacco workers. But, you know, we've worked on things, and I'm hoping that we can continue to do so, because there's so much American history right here in Hartford, Connecticut, that's not really being realized. That was a statement more so than that question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Did you have something you wanted to show us?
No, I'll go to the next question.
Are you familiar with the actress and teacher Gwen Reed?
Yes.
Because I don't know if you call it a monument, but she is memorialized in front of the Hartford Main Library.
Yes. I'm familiar with her. Yeah.
Again, Doctor, thank you very much for being here and enlightening the Greater Hartford area. Just wondering, as far as students are concerned, with your research, can you tell us what schools are participating at the college level? Participating with your research.
So I've worked, so I'm at UConn, so I work with a number of students. I try to do it in class so that they have class credit. And then we've worked with students from Capital and students from Trinity College. We've also gotten students from the Greater Hartford region who may have volunteered through their church. So there've been, I've lost count. I call them the platoon of students. There's been over 100 students who've worked on different iterations, on different iterations of this project. So every semester we try to do a little piece. This year, into June, we're trying to work on the story. So with Catherine Freebody's story, for example, we're trying to figure out if she engaged in any more land transactions, and we're going to put together a biographical profile of her. We found a barber in 1825, a black barber in 1825. We found a West Indian tailor who's been living here maybe earlier, but as early as 1819. And 3 generations of his, he's from Barbados, and 3 generations of his family would go on in the tailoring business and to actually become merchant tailors and to have a merchant tailoring house. There are so many stories of African Americans who are engaged in entrepreneurial activities in Hartford in the 19th century that nobody knows anything about. And perhaps the most important piece of it is that they are writing themselves into history, right? So this black tailor, for example, writes a letter to the Hartford Courant to complain about how he bought a first-class ticket to get to New Haven on the train, but that he and his family were put on the third-class coach for blacks, right? And that letter is right there, and he signs it. So the information is there. I need help out there on the streaming. I need help. It took me almost a whole year to find all of Catherine's information and to run to Simsbury and Granby and live in the deeds office. So I welcome anybody who wants to join me on this endeavor, or to pay my interns to join me on the endeavor.
Fiona, while you're on the topic of education, could you share a little something about the teacher training and curriculum work that you've been involved in?
Yeah, so one of the, I'm doing this because I'm a South African historian. Let me say that first. I'm a South African historian. Yes, I am trained in African American history, but there is such a lack of research on people of color in Hartford. And I don't know that I was voluntarily stepping into the gap. I feel like I was drawn or dragged or sucked in, like in a wormhole, into the gap. And eventually I embraced it and I said, well, why not? Right? Like it is my it's my responsibility as an educator to make sure that I don't keep on complaining about the things that I'm seeing, but to make sure that the students who are in Connecticut public schools don't then turn around and have to complain about not having Black and Latino and Puerto Rican history. And so the primary way that's unfolding is through teacher workshops that we're holding. Right now, with what is Capital's name? I'm sorry.
You can call it Capital.
Capital. So many name changes. We are hosting a teacher workshop on Hartford's Black history. And so we have a cohort of teachers and museum educators and other folks who are in public and community spaces, attending lectures as well as public tours. And then we're providing them with toolkits, with primary sources. We're partnering with GIS folks, other historians, to provide teachers with the primary sources that they're going to need to take some of this information back into their classroom. So my interns are working on curriculum resources so that every school kid in Hartford is going to find out about Catherine Freebody.
So some of that curriculum is being written for Teach It at Connecticut Humanities, which is shared statewide for teachers to use.
Yep.
Your story about Catherine Freebody was fascinating, and I'm wondering if you found out anything about who she was selling or leasing the land to, and what that relationship was with the nephew, the Griswold, was it? Could you talk a little more about that? And then my nosy question is, how much money did she have when she died?
I'm not going to tell you because then you'll know how much money I had in my checking account. So I haven't found this direct relationship with the Griswold. So Freebody, her father, London Freebody, who his name was London, and then he took on the name of Freebody. And I don't know why, but I want to say it's to forcibly assert that he is no longer an enslaved person and he's a free person, because it's a very interesting surname, and it's one of a common surname like Freeman, which is also one of the surnames that African Americans asserted that they were free men. London just did not do very well, notwithstanding the bad land that he was sold. He just didn't have great business partners. He was constantly engaged in land transactions between Simsbury and Granby, but I don't have, I have connections between London and members of the Griswold family, but the men that Catherine is leasing her land to, they seem to just be ordinary residents who were looking for land to farm. And I don't have any specific connection between them and the family. I also have no idea when she comes to Hartford. She's 7 when London dies, and she ends up in the household of the Griswolds. She completely disappears from view until we find her in Hartford in the 1830s, but she's traveling back and forth in these court cases between Granby and Simsbury throughout the 1820s to sue people to pay their lease like they signed up for.
Okay, and then this will be time to wrap up.
One of the black governors listings, there are about a dozen. One of them was listed as London. So I don't know if it's the same London or a different one.
I don't think so. I don't have any evidence that London served as a black governor.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Fiona Vernal.
Thank you. All right.
And thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll have another, we'll have the tour on Saturday. We have another talk the next couple of Thursdays, actually 3 more Thursdays. So please join us for more. There are some refreshments out in the hallway. Thank you again to Connecticut's Old State House, the Democracy Center here, for providing the space, and for CT Network and their work.
Thank you. My chocolate was too sweet. Hey. Oh, sorry, I'm in your way. Oh. Right. Okay, thanks.